Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for joining the podcast of the North-South Dialogue Project. I'm Rituparna, your host for today. This podcast is produced by the collaborative work of the International Policy Institute of the University of Washington and Doing Sociology blog in India. Today, we have Balbir Singh with us. Balbir, can I please ask you to briefly introduce yourself?
Hi Ritu, thanks very much for actually having me. I'm a research scholar at Tata Institute of Social Sciences, pursuing my PhD in Habitat Studies. My PhD research actually focuses on studying formal and informal open spaces over time and space, reflecting on urban transformations and urban politics. I use an interdisciplinary multi-method lens to achieve empirical results, and my broad research areas include development and displacement, and particularly land and urban transformations.
Right. So since we began talking about your research already, could I ask you to talk a little bit about what your research field exactly is, where it is located, and the academic as well as personal inspiration that you might have behind choosing this research topic?
So, coming from background in my undergrad of mass media and my training as a correspondent initially, right? I visited the field a lot, focusing, mainly my writing in areas of sport. I'm really sorry. Yeah. So my work mainly in areas of sports and corporate social responsibility, to be very specific. And from that point of time, I eventually moved into doing my master's in public policy, because the space of policy really interested me, and the kind of insights that I was able to gather from my uh, field, and that generally inspired me to actually find myself doing research more regularly at my in my later end of my masters, because that is also when I joined the election commission. So I was an associate over there, and these interests of sports, election, politics sort of combined, and living in Mumbai throughout my life made me closer to some of these urban questions that were being asked. So I was able to, come up with a research idea at TISS, who was like very welcoming to give me a space for my research in sports, urban politics, and land transformation. So that is also where I find that my study is broadly located within these three aspects, and the interlinks and the different kinds of interfaces these aspects bring to the urban question today, which sociology is sort of grappling with as well. Yeah.
Okay, very interesting. So, could you also talk a little bit about the major research methods that you're using to probe this particular question, and you talk about open spaces and urbanization, as well as the multi-method, research entry point that you're using. So if you could tell our listeners a little bit more about it.
Yeah. So one of the major things that always interested me while I was, formulating, okay, what kind of a land that I should look at, like, for example, my own supervisor, Amitabh Bide, was always interested in looking at the land question from a more social justice housing point of view, right? And I've seen, different authors looking at land differently. What I did find coming from a sports background was a lack of focus and interest by academia generally and sociologists on open spaces. And open spaces was something which was much wider a concept from both rural to urban transformation, both economically and culturally. And that sort of interested me a lot, because open spaces are much more embedded, right, than simply discussing about public spaces, for example, which again have different ways in which they get transformed and made and shaped. And for example, where memoryscapes are sort of also related, but open spaces really brought me closer to linking some of these important questions that I thought would reflect more about urban transformations and their making over time and space. So some of these methods that I use particularly to try and capture such transformations is to basically begin with this question, right? Where will my cases be located and how will I identify them? So there is no one such tool that I pick up to actually find out what my case is. The first step itself is looking at the nature of transformation. So it may be so that within a particular urban space, we have a particular land which is reserved as open space, right? But what happens is we are still grappling with the idea that whether this open space has been acquired by a municipal corporation and then, I mean, sort of finalized into making a garden or something. But what happens is you have different layers to it. So understanding what is the specific nature in which, I mean, something gets formalized and then further corporatized or commodified, right, is something of a trajectory that is largely seen in some of the cases that I've been able to explore empirically. But even beyond that, some of the tools that I specifically focus on is, I mean, GIS, images, I mean, in-depth interviews, observations. RTI again is one such tool that I use to gather data. More methodologically speaking, I've been able to, I've been able to focus on. Can we just pause? I will just have to. Right. So as I was mentioning, so GIS is, I mean, one such tool, including, I mean, RTI, because different kinds of steps, right? When I talk about, I mean, exploring urban transformations over time and space, looking at, I mean, these specific tools to capture information, right, about land use, land cover, is something that becomes not just embedded in one particular tool, but each tool then has a very specific role in which, I mean, it gives you specific information in return. So some of the methods that I'm trying to grapple with and, I mean, explore in the Indian context is one is Michael Borroway's extended case method. The other is, I mean, Alan Prate's placemaking approach. Placemaking is something that has been more recently explored and even previously explored in terms of land use, land cover analysis, both, I mean, outside the Indian context largely, but also more specifically in India, I mean, in the works of Himanshu Bhute, right? Who has, I mean, looked at world-class city making from, I mean, road infrastructure perspective through a study of the JVLR project. What I try to do is, I mean, apply placemaking and use some of these tools to explore open spaces and, I mean, then also look at particular aspects of aesthetic politics. I mean, doing at some level policy analysis as well when I encounter with challenges of open spaces and how they get defined under policy, how urban governance, I mean, regulatory governance comes into play, and the broader question of community development in sports that lies within such open space transformations too.
All right. Okay. So your research also seems something which is quite unique and new, particularly in the Indian context. Will you be able to mention maybe a few works that align with what you are doing either in India or outside? Is it for the betterment of our listeners?
Great. So if one has to, I mean, go back and look for more contemporary sort of authors, right? I mean, Kaushal Bandyopadhyay's contributions to sports sociology is, I mean, one place to basically start off with, right? Deborah Waldman actually, and I mean, Asha Gertner's more recent work on aesthetic politics, I mean, Solomon Benjamin's work on aesthetic politics in the slums, even Himanshu Bhute, Dr. Parthasathi's work from IIT Bombay is something that is worth looking up. Amitabh Bavaskar, Leela Fernandez, I mean, their work on middle class activism and how middle class politics is currently shaping. All these implicate the work that I'm currently doing. More specifically, there's a book that has recently come out on sports sociology, which is edited by Meena Gopal. And so I was lucky enough to have Meena Gopal as one of my faculty mentors as at TES as well when I was doing my MPhil. So all these experiences also come put together, help me, exploring such a field, more specifically grappling with, okay, what existing areas and dominant ideas in sociology and how they shape uh, sports sociology research in India is something that is very, very interesting. And looking at then the broader question of urban politics and urban transformation within this is, I feel, a, a research agenda in itself, right? That how such an urban space can be imagined, and when we move forward with such a research agenda, more and more empirical research, whether it's looking at basic mapping of open spaces, or whether we look at studying the uses of open spaces by different classes of people. More importantly, and something that is most relevant to understanding space today in India, is attempting to embed caste within exploring space, urban space. So I think so. Himanshu Bhurti recently wrote about this in seminar about white space. Looking at how, for example, the Indian modernity, right? He calls it the space as white space, where you have the broader implications of caste and how that in turn shapes the ecological, socio-cultural and political debates around it. So we have like a good bunch of scholars who are both theorizing and working on empirical research, and I think it's a good start for scholars like me as well, who are like, found their interest, I guess.
Right. It sounds very interesting. And last question. So, since you have been doing this research very recently, what are some of the major challenges that you have faced in, either be your research or writing, anything?
Correct. So some of the more specific sites that I've worked with as well, right, have largely remained within urban municipal corporations. So it would be very interesting, to move forward into urban local bodies that are much more closer to, still predominantly rural economies, right? And that is one of the basic, aspects that I would like to point out is, how do you capture something as broad as sports today in India without moving too quickly into generalizations and conclusions. So one of the major things is once I identify the cases, right, one of the major challenges that I then face is, once I've done the mapping, okay, this is the nature of transformation from secondary literature that I could make, and maybe the existing literature tells me some piece of information that my research questions could, or maybe some of the questions that I may ask in the interview come from. But the major question becomes, where and when do I enter the field as a researcher? At what point I myself am able to identify, okay, this could be a case study for me. And I'm very conscious of the fact, like when exactly am I entering, and what actors are at play when I'm trying to, frame my research questions. And what if, I would have done this 10 years ago, for instance. So this entry point into the field itself is a very big challenge, correct? And something that quality care researchers continue to get implicated by, something like as simple as triangulation of your results, right? So you have a lot of issues with, when people start to remember dates and events, and something like this is also difficult when you have a very specific plot or a very specific site that you are trying to explore. So you are, as far as that empirical study is concerned, you don't go beyond, that those particular dimensions, right, to make sense of what you're trying to say. But sometimes people's memory don't serve them well. And like some of the people that I interacted with were quite aged, and they weren't successfully able to remember names. Sometimes I had to do 3, 4, 5 rounds of interviews, and I'm just lucky to, have these people who are able to give me time, right? So that is one major challenge. The other concern again is, with use of RTI and even public records in general. Public records, reading of public records is a politics in itself, right? What kind of language was being used in 60s by the revenue department of a particular state will be very different from the kind of bureaucratic shifts that have happened and how land records today are being recorded. So these are small minor aspects of research that for me as a researcher I have to grapple with. Language certainly is one major aspect. uh, Again, one another small bit that I would like to add and conclude with is also this bit when, for example, when I have to go to the field, right? Something staying in Mumbai, of course, helps me because I'm much more familiar with when some person talks about, okay, like an event. I'm much more familiar with, okay, coming from Mumbai, that I know certain history and I know most some of these events. So there's a lot of course correction as well. Sometimes they correct me, and when you grapple with, okay, what kind of timeline you're wanting to portray in a case study, is something that this trust building also comes in. And this is, very important, and something that ethical issues are also concerned with. And yeah, most importantly is my own experience in the field and my own experience working in sports, my own, experience being a sports person myself, up until my graduation, that genuinely interests me to continue to and contribute to sports today in India. And yeah, like those experiences are something that I continue to acknowledge in every paper that I write. And something that researchers, like generally don't focus on as well. So it was very interesting for me to actually again go back 8 years, 9 years into understanding, okay, how did I come about with this research question of exploring land, politics, and sports together. So that was certainly something where my interview skills as a correspondent, maybe my training as a public policy student helped me, and then my own training as a qualitative researcher at STES sort of has helped me put together these, jumbled thoughts together into one single study.
Right. Thank you, Balbir. Thank you so much for taking time out to do this. For our, sorry, you wanted to say something.
No, I'm really thankful for the platform as well, and I hope the research agenda that is at place could get the recognition today, and I hope with the kind of scholarship that is coming up, it could grow much more.
Right. So thank you everyone for listening to the podcast of the North-South Dialogue Project. If you want to be featured in this podcast, please send an email to nsdialogue@uw.edu with a brief introduction of yourself and the research. Thank you everyone, and see you in the next podcast.